The secret logging railroads that built America, 1880 to 1920. In 1901, a man named Simon Benson built 54 miles of private railroad through the Oregon Cascades and never carried a single passenger. Every car hauled timber. By the time his rails reached the Columbia River, he had moved 400 million board feet of old-growth fir. That's enough wood to build every house in Portland twice, and his railroad was just one of 300 logging railroads hidden in America's forests that nobody outside the timber camps ever knew existed. I've spent months digging through the records on these lines, county maps, timber company ledgers, payroll books stained with coffee and pitch, and the thing that keeps coming back to me is this: most Americans today drive over the ghosts of these rail beds every week and never know it. The trail you hike on. The gravel road behind your cabin. That suspicious flat line cutting sideways across a mountain. A lot of that was railroad once, wooden ties still under the moss. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the ones nobody put on a stamp, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Everything we do here is about the forgotten work, the forgotten names, the forgotten machines. Stick with me, because what these men pulled off in the timber country, I still don't entirely understand how they did it. And I've been looking. Here's the part that nobody teaches. In 1880, America was running out of accessible timber. The great white pine forests of Michigan and Wisconsin were already stumps. Maine was cut. Pennsylvania was cut. The country was building cities at a speed the world had never seen. Chicago after the fire, the tenements of New York, the new brick and board towns rising on the prairie every spring, and all of it was hungry for wood. Framing lumber, shingles, railroad ties, mine timbers, fence rails, barrels. The problem was simple and awful. All the easy trees were gone. What was left stood in places that seemed to mock the men who came looking. Ridges at 4,000 feet, canyon walls, swamps that swallowed a horse to the withers, the big fir and cedar of the Pacific Northwest, the cypress bottoms of Louisiana, the spruce slopes of West Virginia, trees so big a man couldn't get his arms a quarter of the way around them, and not a single road to any of it. So how do you get a 200-foot tree off a mountain? Oxen could drag logs a mile, maybe two on a grease skid road. After that, the log won out, and the ox died. Rivers worked in some places if you had a river and the river ran the right direction and didn't freeze 6 months a year. Most timber didn't have a river. Most timber sat up on a slope at a grade no wagon could climb and no standard locomotive could pull. And that's the question that hangs over the whole era. How do you get millions of tons of wood down off a mountain that has no road, no river, and no reason to exist except that it happened to grow the trees the country needed? The answer, when it came from a man in Michigan who had never been to college. His name was Shay, and he changed everything. Shay was born in Ohio in 1839. He fought in the Civil War with a Michigan regiment, came home thin and coughing, and settled in a little timber town called Herring. He ran a small sawmill. He built his own narrow-gauge track out of hemlock poles so he could haul logs in winter. The track sagged. The locomotives of the day couldn't handle the grades. So he sat down in his shop and drew up a locomotive that didn't work like any other locomotive on Earth. A normal steam locomotive drives its wheels directly from the pistons. 2 big wheels, long connecting rods, and when you hit a grade steeper than about 2%, the wheels slip and you're stuck. Shay's design was different. He mounted 3 vertical cylinders on the side of the boiler. They turned a long drive shaft. That shaft turned small gears. Those gears turned every single wheel under the locomotive. Every wheel, every axle, no slip. The Shay could climb a 14% grade. For comparison, a regular freight locomotive maxes out around 2%. A 14% grade is steeper than most driveways. It's steeper than some ski runs. And Shay's little geared locomotive would crawl up it at 4 miles an hour, hauling 60,000 pounds of green timber, belching black smoke, gears whining like a sawmill in a storm. He patented it in 1881. Lima Locomotive Works of Ohio started building them. Over the next 40 years, Lima would build 2,761 Shay locomotives. Every one of them went into the woods. And around those locomotives, the logging railroad was born. Here's the contradiction that keeps me up. More than 300 logging railroads operated in the United States between 1880 and 1920. Thousands of miles of track, hundreds of locomotives, tens of thousands of men, and almost none of it shows up on a modern map, because almost none of it lasted. Sure, the average logging railroad ran for 5 to 10 years, hauled out every stick of merchantable timber within reach, and then the company pulled up the rails, loaded them on flat cars, and moved to the next valley. The forest came back, the ties rotted, the trestles fell. Before I tell you how they built those trestles and what it cost the men who built them, do me a favor. Hit the subscribe button. This channel lives or dies on subscribers, and the algorithm buries old industry stories unless people tell it we care. So tell it. One click, then come back, because we're going up the hill with Simon Benson. Simon Benson was born in Norway in 1852. His family came through Ellis Island when he was 15. He worked as a farmhand in Wisconsin, saved his money, and by 25 he was in Oregon running a logging outfit with borrowed oxen and a single crosscut saw. He didn't drink, he didn't gamble, he read contracts the way other men read scripture. And by 1900, he owned some of the finest fir country on the Columbia. The fir stood 250 feet tall, 6, 8, 10 feet across at the base. A single tree might yield 20,000 board feet of clear grain lumber, enough to frame 4 houses. Benson looked at that timber and he did the math. Oxen couldn't move it. The river was miles below. So in 1901 he started building 54 miles of private railroad. Through country so steep, the survey crew roped themselves together. Upgrades that would have broken a standard engine in half a mile. He ordered Shay locomotives. He hired Finns and Norwegians and Swedes who'd grown up cutting spruce in the old country. He paid in gold coin on Saturday nights because he didn't trust the local banks. And within 2 years, his little railroad was moving more timber than some entire states. 400 million board feet before he was done. Enough wood, as I said at the start, to build every house in Portland, twice. But those numbers don't tell you what it took. The numbers never do. For that, you have to look at the men. I want to tell you about 2 of them. Not the owners, not the managers, 2 working men whose names I pulled out of a water-stained logbook from the Benson camp, cross-referenced against census records and a couple of cemetery rolls in Clatsop County. The first man was John Sari. Age 24, born in Finland, came to Astoria with his mother and 2 sisters in 1896. By 1903, he was working as a choker setter in Benson's Woods. A choker setter is the man who wraps the steel cable around a felled log so the donkey engine can drag it to the rail siding. It's the most dangerous job in the camp, except maybe for the faller himself. You work under logs that weigh 40 tons. If the cable snaps, and cables snapped every week, the whiplash will cut a man in half. John Sari was small, 5'6", maybe 140 pounds. The foreman liked small men for choker work because they could get under the log. He made $2.25 a day. He sent $1 of it home to his mother every week. He was engaged to a girl named Hilma who worked at the Astoria cannery. In May of 1904, he bought her a silver ring. In July of 1904, a spar pole let go during a cable transfer, and the broken cable took John Sari's left leg off above the knee. He bled out before they got him down the mountain on the flat car. He was 24. The company paid Hilma $50 and his last week's wages. His name is on a flat granite stone in Astoria. No dates, just John Sari, logger. That was one man. There were thousands. Because here's the statistic I keep coming back to, and I've checked it against 3 separate sources. The logging railroads killed more workers per mile of track than any railroad in American history. Not the transcontinental, not the big freight haulers, logging. A man died for every quarter mile of rail in some camps, cave-ins, runaway log cars, boiler explosions, rotten trestles that gave way under a loaded train, widowmakers, loose branches that dropped from 150 feet up and hit a man on the head while he ate his lunch. The second man was named Elias Whitcomb, age 41, born in Franklin, West Virginia, in a cabin his father built from chestnut logs cut on the property. He came west after the Panic of 1893, wiped out the family's small sawmill. By 1905, he was a brakeman on a Shay locomotive working a steep spur up the Lewis River in Washington. He had a wife named Abigail and 4 children. A brakeman on a logging railroad didn't ride in a caboose. He rode on top of the log cars, in the rain, in the snow, with a long hickory brake stick. When the engineer whistled down brakes, Elias would run from car to car along the tops of the logs, stabbing the stick into the brake wheels and throwing his whole weight on them. If he slipped, he went under the wheels. If he missed a car, the train ran away. In March of 1907, a trestle 2 miles above the landing gave way during a storm. The Shay went over first. 12 loaded cars followed. Elias Whitcomb rode the lead car 80 feet down into the creek. They pulled his body out the next morning, still clutching the brake stick. His wife got the railroad standard payment, $100, and his tools. She moved back to West Virginia with the children. 2 of the boys later worked the coal mines. 1 was killed in a rockfall in 1931. I know those stories are hard. I promised I'd tell you how they built those trestles, and I want to, because the engineering is the part that makes me shake my head. These were not bridges the way we think of bridges. No steel, no concrete, no survey crews in white hats. The men who built the trestles on a logging railroad used the trees they felled that morning. A bridge crew of 12 to 15 men could put up a 100-foot-high trestle across a ravine in 2 days. 2 days. They dropped the big firs along the ravine walls, dragged them into position with the donkey engine, notched them with axes, just axes, no chainsaws for another 30 years, and stacked them into bents, cross-bracing pegged with oak trunnels, wooden stringers on top, then the rails, spiked directly into green timber that was still sweating sap. These trestles were never meant to last. They were calculated to survive about 7 years, which was roughly the life of the logging show in that valley. Some lasted longer, some gave way in the first winter. When one failed and a train went into the ravine, the company didn't usually rebuild. They'd route the spur around the damage, abandon the wreckage. You can still find Shay locomotives rusting in Pacific Northwest gorges where they fell in 1908 and nobody ever bothered to haul them out. Too deep. Too hard, too expensive. Track laying went at 1 to 2 miles a day through virgin forest. Think about that for a second. In country that had never been walked by a surveyor, where a man on foot might make 3 miles in a full day of thrashing through Devil's Club and slash. A logging railroad crew, 40 or 50 men, maybe a team of mules, a donkey engine for the heavy lifting, laid 1 to 2 miles of running track. Every day, cut the right-of-way, grubbed the stumps, graded the bed with shovels and horse-drawn scrapers, laid ties cut on-site from hemlock or fir, spiked the rails, moved on. A camp of 200 men could build 15 miles of railroad in 2 weeks, log out a section for a year, pull the rails, and be gone by the time the snow flew. By the next summer, the alder and the salmonberry were already crawling back over the grade. In 5 years, you couldn't find it. In 10 years, nobody remembered it had been there. Which is the thing I want you to really sit with. Please, if you've stayed with me this far, subscribe. I mean it. This is where the channel lives. Hit that button, come back for the next one. Because the next part is the part that almost nobody writes about. Day-to-day life in a logging railroad camp was brutal and strange and beautiful all at once. I've read dozens of diaries from these camps, written in pencil, spelled by ear, men who could barely read English but could drop a 200-foot tree into a gap 6 feet wide. Up at 4:30 in the dark. Breakfast in a cookhouse where the cook, usually a Chinese man on the West Coast camps, a black cook in the Southern Cyprus operations, had been up since 2. Flapjacks, bacon, black coffee, beans. No talking at the table. It was bad luck, and it wasted time. A man who talked at breakfast got a look from the foreman he remembered all week. Out to the cut by lantern light. The fallers and the buckers worked the standing timber. The choker setters and the whistle punks worked the logs. The engineer and the brakemen worked the Shay. The track crew pushed the rails deeper into the valley, 100 yards at a time. Noon meal came on the flat car. The cookhouse boy rode out with a tin kettle of stew. The men ate sitting on a log, 10 minutes. Then back to it. Quitting time was when it got too dark to see the saw. Sometimes 8 in the evening in the summer. You walked back to the camp, 2 miles, 3 miles, in boots that weighed 5 pounds each with the mud on them. You hung your wet wool in the drying shed. You ate again. You were asleep before your head touched the ticking. Saturday was payday in some camps. Sunday, if the foreman was Christian, was off. If he wasn't, you worked. Mail came once every 2 weeks if the logging train brought it from the main line. Men wrote letters home they never mailed because there was no envelope in camp. I've read those letters, folded 4 times, kept in a boot. Dear Mother, I am well. The trees here are as big as churches. Tell Anna I think of her. John. What did it all build? That's the honest question, because the men paid for it with their bodies, and the forests paid for it with their oldest trees. And I think we owe them at least the courtesy of knowing what we got. We got the cities, the Chicago that rose after the fire, San Francisco after the earthquake, the endless grid of Midwestern farm towns with their false front main streets and their grain elevators and their Victorian houses with carved porches, the railroad ties under the transcontinental lines, billions of them, most cut by logging railroads, the mine timbers that held up the copper drifts of Butte and the coal seams of Pennsylvania, the pulp that fed the newspapers of a country that had just learned to read at scale. America between 1880 and 1920 was a country being built, physically, out of the forests that the Shay locomotives pulled out of the mountains. There was no substitute material, steel was expensive, concrete was rare, plastic didn't exist. Everything, house, barn, bridge, fence, coffin, was wood. And almost every stick of that wood came out of a camp somewhere. I was on a railroad that ran for a few years and then vanished. The transformation was brutal and complete. Whole mountain ranges went from old-growth canopy to stump fields in a single decade. The big woods of Michigan, 30 million acres of white pine, gone by 1900. The longleaf pine of the Gulf South, 90 million acres, gone by 1920. The Douglas fir of the Oregon Cascades, Simon Benson's country, cut and replanted and cut again. What took 500 years to grow came down in an afternoon and rode to town on a flat car. And then the men went home. Or they didn't. A lot of them stayed in the little towns the railroads had created, Wanna, Vernonia, Cascade Locks, and they got older and their backs gave out and they drew a small pension if the company had one, and most companies didn't. They told stories in the tavern on Friday nights. Young men didn't always listen. Some of those towns are gone now too. Ghost towns of boarded storefronts with the name of a timber company still faintly painted on the brick. Churches with caved-in roofs. Cemeteries where every third stone says logger or railroader under the name. One more ask from me, and then I'll finish. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the real work, the real men, the stuff that isn't in the history books, subscribe. That's the whole pitch. I'll keep finding these stories as long as you keep telling the algorithm we want them. Here's the last thing. The thing I think about when I drive through the Cascades or the Appalachians or the cutover country of northern Michigan. You will be driving some afternoon on a forest road. It will feel like a normal road, a little narrow, a little too level for the terrain around it, and on your right or your left, there will be a bench cut into the side of the hill, a flat ribbon of ground running parallel to the road and then curving away into the trees. You might not even notice it unless somebody tells you what it is. That was a railroad. Once. In 1903 or 1911 or 1917, a Shay locomotive crawled along that bench hauling 40-ton logs down to a landing 2 miles below. A man named John or Elias or Per or Hiram rode the top of those log cars in the rain. A choker setter knelt under the log and wrapped the cable. A cook stirred a pot of beans at 4 a.m. in a bunkhouse 2 ridges over. And all of them are gone. And the railroad is gone. And the trees that stood here then are gone. But the ground remembers. The bench is still cut. The spikes are still in the dirt. And if you get down on your knees in the fern and push the moss aside, you will find, sometimes, the end of a wooden tie. Still there, still smelling faintly of creosote and pitch. I've put my hand on those ties. Nobody stopped to look. Nobody put up a sign. No plaque. No marker. Just the bench and the hill and the men who are not in any book. 300 railroads, tens of thousands of men, billions of board feet, 5 to 10 years each, and then gone. That was the logging railroads of America, 1880 to 1920. That was the work that built the country you live in. I'm glad you stayed with me. Tell me in the comments if one of your own people, a grandfather, a great uncle, worked the timber. I read every comment. I'll see you in the next one.